Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the Daily Friend Show. I'm your host, Nicholas Lorimer, and I'm joined today by Mr. Michael Morris. Michael, how are you doing?
I'm very well, thank you. Being load shed at the moment, though you wouldn't necessarily say so. We all managed to cope reasonably well with these things.
Me too. I'm enjoying a good 4 hours of load shedding. Certainly, puts hair on one's chest. And also, yes. Ms. Sara Gon. Sara, how are you?
I'm in that short period between load shedding and lots of load shedding. So you got
wonderful.
me.
Wonderful.
Make the most of it.
And I'm sure we're going to talk about it probably in the coming week. But I see once again Eskom is playing silly games with being a little bit vague about precisely what stage we're in, saying that they're shedding a certain number of megawatts, but then saying that we're a stage below that, and that they're doing something that means that we're not in stage 7, even though we should be. Or it's all a bit. It's a little bit clandestine, and that's exactly what worries me, actually, because I feel like at least while the Rata was there, as dysfunctional as Eskom was, it more or less was honest with the situation. I'm not sure if that's true anymore. Anyway, so let us get into the news. And I think the first thing we're going to talk about is the sort of shaping up of the battlefield in the electoral politics of 2024. And this is now being very aggressively pushed by the DA, what they're calling their moonshot pact. They came out with this at their Congress at the beginning of this month, where re-elected party leader John Steenhuisen is talking about forming a coalition of like-minded parties to prevent the EFF and the ANC from forming I can't remember what phrase he used, I think it was a doomsday coalition. As he calls it, that would send the country hurtling down the road of the National Democratic Revolution at an even greater rate. And this is very similar to what we've been talking about for the last, I would say, 18 months or so on the podcast, about the so-called Wild Dogs Coalition. This idea that there's going to be a sort of motley collection of parties that don't necessarily have that much in common, except that they're united against the ANC and EFF. At the same time as Steenhuisen talks about the Moonshot Pact, he says that they're already in talks with Action SA and the Inkatha Freedom Party, that they're a little bit unsure about where the United Democratic Movement, that is Bantu Holomisi's party, is. And he says that he's, however, not really received much support for his Moonshot Pact from the ACDP and the UDM and the new party being started by Bongani Baloyi. At the same time as the DA is sort of trying to get together some allies, the ANC is getting together some allies in the form of the EFF. And we see now that at the backing of Panyaza Lesufi in Gauteng, the ANC has gotten the support of the national government to move ahead with forming more permanent, stronger alliances with the EFF in the metros and potentially even the province of Gauteng in the 2024 election and perhaps in national. So it looks like the two coalitions are quite formalizing themselves ahead of time, actually. And I think it's going to be, that's kind of the terms of engagement for the coming election. Sara, what do you make of all this? Let's start kind of, I think, with the Moonshot Pact stuff. Do you think that the DA is going to be able to pull it off? Obviously, I think some of these smaller parties are very hesitant about getting into bed with the DA. They fear that they'll just be run over, that they'll be ignored, that they'll just be kind of used as a pawn by the DA. What do you make of all this?
Yeah, I find that quite intriguing because, to be a little blunt about it, they are really small and the DA, relatively speaking, is really big. And if they are pawns, well, so be it. If they fulfill a function just for that, it's quite funny. I think they're sort of hanging out a little bit for the being king makers or prince makers or something of that ilk. But really, it's like I think they'll probably all come on board, because if they don't, they're going to be nowhere. And to say, okay, well, we'll go to the ANC EFF is going to look really, really bad, because if anyone's stuck with them for long enough, there are people who will vote for them in order to keep the ANC out to greater or lesser extent. I think we will probably see a little more measured coalition situation, both because of the moonshot in particular, because there was I have to say, a funny interview with Gayton McKenzie on BizNews, Alec Hog's, and he was basically apologizing for the mistakes he'd made, and particularly supporting the mayor of Johannesburg, who in various very colorful terms he basically described as a young boy who didn't know very much, which I think is pretty much the line. But he said some things that I thought, I was in support of. I thought were quite funny. But I think he's probably learned a little, been burnt by this jumping out of the coalition, the Rainbow Coalition, to the ANC EFF. He's learned that he gives them support, but they don't give him what he expected in return. I think a whole lot of people are going to be chastened, and the little rats and mice may come on board in due course. But I don't know. I don't know anything about negotiating coalition agreements. But I would, if once the bigger parties have bought in, I would start the negotiations and wait for the smaller ones to come in, because I think there's a very real risk either way that if the coalition represents any level of stability in the upcoming elections, some of the people are going to jump from those small parties and they will vote DA or FF plus or whatever else it may be. And it probably would be DA. But things are that bad. I think the one advantage is that with all the faffing and fuffing, coalition politics in the national context is a less messy affair than in the municipal context. And we're not dealing with the municipal context next year. I mean, the faffing and fuffing in the municipal context carries on apace. Just when you think it couldn't get any sillier, it sure and hell does. But I think for the national, it's starting to be evened out. And the ANC EFF, it's very interesting because one assumes that Ramaphosa must have given his imprimatur to it. Panyaza Lesufi being the big mover and shaker on this, and he's more EFF. But I have to say, I was quite amused when I read the article that said the national office bearers approved it. In brackets, knobs, close brackets.
So obviously the DA wants to get into national government, and that's partly why they're trying to put this thing together. And obviously they're opposed ideologically to both the ANC and the EFF. But it's also clear that there's a sort of tactical element, I think, in this moonshot pact idea, which is they're sort of trying to pin the other opposition parties to them so that they can't be campaigned against by them. Because if you think about it, if you're the IFP or Action SA or something, or I don't know, the Freedom Front Plus, it's going to be a bit awkward if you've joined this so-called moonshot pact with DA to then kind of trash them during the election. You would have to be quite complicated in your messaging as to, well, you should still vote for us because of X, Y, or Z. And I think it could be done, but it does mean then that the kind of energy is more focused on the ANC, which of course the DA would prefer than energy focused on them. Michael, what do you make of all this?
I think that's a very good point. And the more I think about it, and just talking to people who are not particularly active in the political realm, but are, interested, as we all are, in what's going to happen. And the thing that I keep hearing is that term moonshot pact. I think that was quite a clever thing to have conceived of that little phrase. Because it incorporates a kind of certain sense of urgency, certain sense of kind of monumental effort that's going to be required. This quite a phenomenal sort of mission to get from here to there, and it just captures all that. And as you say, anyone who's going to go against that is going to have to do a lot of explaining, I think. And looking at John Steenhuisen's quote in the EWN piece about. Where he says he must report with deep disappointment that the following three party leaders have rejected the plea for cooperation, and the first is Reverend Kenneth Meshu from the ACDP, General Bantu Holomisa from the United Democratic Movement, and Bongani Baloyi from Kiluva. And so, it's that's putting, I would have thought, quite big pressure on those three. I just, as an aside, I was tickled to see a tweet. I'm not a great Twitter follower, but I happened to notice this morning from Ryan Kutsia, responding to Bongani Baloyi, saying that he bets him 10,000 rand. 10,000 rand goes to charity if Kiluva manages to get a single seat. So coming from an experienced political watcher, that's quite a daunting challenge, I think. And indeed, looking at that very interesting piece by Natasha Marion of Financial Mail on, was it Friday, I think, end of last week, about the where the ANC exactly is standing vis-a-vis the EFF. Is it going to go into the sort of pact in Gauteng with them? And as you say, Sara, the knobs have nodded to that arrangement. But she ends the piece by talking about South Africa's chaotic coalition space is once again in flux. Various things happening this week that are going to point to certain immediate sort of outcomes. But everybody looking at who's gathering around, coalescing around the moonshot pact. But her final 5 words are probably the most important. Voters will be watching closely, and I think that's true. I suppose the other risk, and I was just thinking about it as we were chatting earlier, and it's really why the RSR's Pledge to Vote campaign, if you haven't visited the site, do go and do that and show your support for that initiative. Pledge to Vote. It's very important because the thing that I so often come across is, just in general conversation with people, is they're just so disenchanted, disenthralled by anything to do with politics, because all it looks like is this little band of self-interested people angling for positions at any cost, chopping and changing, jumping in and out of bed with different people. And that's often what this sort of horse trading seems to be to people who are not really great political watchers, or even to those who are. And I think there is a grave risk in a way that people will actually just not bother to vote or not bother to participate because it's looking all so tacky and so on. So let's hope. I think the Moonshot Pact idea was a clever one. I think that sort of concentrates the mind in a way, and hopefully will concentrate the mind of smaller parties. I absolutely agree with Sara also that the small fry are small fry, and their own voters will be very, very disenchanted if they make the wrong, if they jump to the wrong school. So yeah, learning to be a good pawn is actually probably a useful task for them.
Well, the humble pawn can do many powerful things in chess. So
Exactly. Yeah.
I see also in the tone of the statement that DA put out, they're trying really hard to avoid the arrogance thing that's been thrown at them a lot in recent months. What was the phrase here? To those leaders who have said no to the pact, I ask you to unclench your fists so that we may take our hands and work together. Which is, I don't know, it sounds a little bit poetic, but it's relatively good stuff. Just one last thing. I don't think we're going to get a chance to cover it on the show, but Bloemfontein is kind of another example of the sort of messiness of all these coalitions, and also of the internal dynamics of the ANC, which I wonder how big of a role that's going to play in 2024, because the ANC last week lost control of Bloemfontein, a city in which they hold a majority, to a councillor from, what was it called? The African Social Democrat Party, which is a tiny party with, I think, 1 seat in the whole country. Managed to secure the mayorship with the DA and the other smaller parties working together, along with some ANC defectors. So that's quite embarrassing. Sara, any final thoughts before we move on? Just to
say, I don't think going to the coalition would be negative for the voters of the small parties, because I think most of them see that that's their identity, that's where they want to go. If they go into the coalition, they at least play a role in the national in the national governance debate. Without being, if they're not there, and this goes ahead, they really are not there. They are out in the cold. And I think I don't think that's something that they should be concerned about.
All right, let's move on to our next story. And this is interesting sort of continuation of, I guess, the kind of policy ideas and personnel stasis within government, particularly with regards to load shedding and why one should be very skeptical of, and I'm sure most listeners to the show already are, but of the ANC's promises that, what is it that Enoch Godongwana said closer to the beginning of the year, we'll fix load shedding in 18 months. So there's a story out in the media about how President Ramaphosa has some dilemmas in determining who is responsible for what between his three ministers who are responsible for Eskom, right? So we've got the Minister of Mining and Energy, which is Gwede Mantashe. We've got the Public Enterprises Minister, and we've got the new Minister in the Presidency of Electricity, who is Ramaphosa. Reportedly, Ramaphosa was said to receive a number of powers which would help him to control the energy policy regarding particularly emergency procurement of electricity stuff. So this is potentially, if you're looking at it from a patronage corruption point of view, a very lucrative power to hold, because you can direct the resources in towards your favored electricity type and provider. However, it seems as though this power already rests with Gwede Mantashe, who pushed back and seems to have managed to maintain that power within his control. Mantashe said that to the journalists who asked him about this, there was no conflict over who this power had. It was never debated. I can't have a power struggle when I have a responsibility already assigned to me. Ramaphosa is supposed to be in charge of the Energy Action Plan and the National Energy Crisis Committee, which really doesn't sound that exciting if you're looking to get your hands in the corruption pie. I don't know. Sara, what do you make of all of this?
Well, there's no doubt. I mean, Gwede Mantashe can be the slowest, laziest, most uncooperative minister on South African soil, but he's powerful. He holds something over Ramaphosa, and Ramaphosa needed, if he thought that Ramaphosa would be best placed to do an element of Gwede's job, and I think transmission is largely the area considered. He should have held, if that was the issue, he should have sort of held firm and said to Gwede, I'm giving this over for these and these reasons. He could have made something up, and we do need to get some things done. But I'm sure Ramaphosa very likely at the last minute flinched and decided he was not going to run up against the old bull that is Gwede Mantashe. So you have the problem where you've got the electricity minister who's, as much as possible, been brought in to try and make things happen faster, make them work to some extent. And, he's now discovered how rotten our infrastructure is, and hence stage 6, stage 7 load shedding. And now he's got probably not a lot of power to do anything about it. So is anyone surprised?
This remains, Michael, a really big problem for the ANC, is that it has these sort of ideological objectives, but it also has the electoral objectives, right? It wants to pursue the national democratic revolution and move society to a position where it's in the center of control. At the same time, it wants to make sure that it remains electable and popular and able to win elections with majorities. But it can't really do either of these particularly well, because it's just so hamstrung by the enormous amounts of infighting. It's kind of bizarre to watch. Is that sort of Ramaphosa, who's once again elected with an even stronger mandate than last time, who is the most popular politician in the country, probably, despite the fact that his popularity has begun to slip. He can't defeat ANC internal politics to the extent that his own choice of electricity minister, we're not even talking here about major reform, it's just he wanted this guy to have these powers, and he doesn't seem to have been able to swing that. I don't know. What do you make of all this?
It is extraordinary. I liked Peter Bruce's characterization of it last week, where he said, where Ramaphosa rules, the left hand doesn't know what the other left hand is, which I thought sort of captured it perfectly. And his rider after they was asked the Guptas. But yeah, I mean, here we have, one more minister being appointed into a sector that requires a lean, brutal team to step in and say, this is what we need to do. Well, we can understand that the ANC is actually beyond finding that solution. I think it just doesn't have the internal cohesion to carry it through. It doesn't have the leadership, despite, as you say, Ramaphosa's this immensely popular figure. It appears to be, all the polling suggests that without him, the ANC would be a great deal lesser in terms of its electoral appeal and kind of belief in the future and so on. And yet he seems unable to do it. So I think the combination of the electoral challenge and the electricity challenge have come together to create this perfect storm, actually, for Ramaphosa and for the ANC itself. And it didn't surprise me at all. I think was it last week that a clever economist, I think perhaps working in the banking sector, did some research to show that in fact the considerable economic boost is likely down the line simply from the fact that the private sector is stepping in to respond to the crisis, and that it's going to generate sort of new economic opportunities and cash in the bank for businesses in those fields. So yeah, it's a very messy place to be in, I think, for the ANC.
And one kind of feels as though, I mean, there's this great saying, something that can't go on forever won't go on forever. And
yeah,
one feels a little bit like that way about the ANC, is that in some way it's going to radically transform. It's either going to collapse and lose power, or it's going to change itself. I'm not sure in what direction, perhaps a more authoritarian direction. I think the chances of it changing in a more reformist direction are very long dead. Sara, any final thoughts before we move on?
Just to say that there's a certain sort of Shakespearean tragedy quality about this, in that when Ramaphosa came in, given his favorability amongst ANC supporters, it was tight, but he was in. And if he had grabbed the nettle and ruled, governed the country and pulled the ANC's kicking and screaming, we could have been in a very different place looking at a very different thing. We now know, of course, that he's not that. He is a party man to the nth. And as a result, he's displayed a spectacular lack of action and energy. And I mean, look, Zuma done a hell of a lot of damage, but there is no reason we had to be in the situation we are now. And certainly with the support he got this time, he could really have, taken the ANC. Everyone would be an underling to him. And he hasn't taken the opportunity, so he is nobody's man.
Yeah, except the unity of the ANC, which seems to be the only thing Ramaphosa ever puts any real energy into.
I agree. I just think the only problem is that he may be putting energy into it, but I'm not sure he's getting anything out of it.
Well, that's a good one. Yeah. Well, to be fair, the ANC hasn't split again, so maybe he has been more successful, at least in that regard, than pretty much everything else he seems to have done. All right, let us move on to our next story, and we're going overseas for this one, and it is, in some ways, I think, kind of the end of an era, which is that in China, in the Beijing subway, the mask mandate requiring all Chinese traveler, anyone using that subway system, to wear a mask to prevent the spread of COVID-19 has been lifted, and that Chinese health authorities, after very much hyping up the damage and the dangers of COVID and locking down the country in some of the most draconian, aggressive lockdowns we've seen anywhere in the world, long after the rest of the world had given up on that policy, has finally lifted this mask mandate. It still requires people who I think are infected or exposed to an infection to wear masks, but even Chinese state media is sort of blowing the horn that it's now been victorious against the virus, and it's time for China and the world to move on. And this kind of seems like the very tail end of what has been a pretty intense and also pretty bizarre period of policy and discussion and political discussion over the last few years, which is, of course, the COVID pandemic. It really does seem like this is the final lingering remains. Michael, you had some thoughts on what we can take from kind of China doing this and its response to the disease.
Indeed, and the thing that I mean, we were all chatting, you and Sara too, about this element just before we began the show, and what it kind of reveals is the sluggishness of a country like China. That's very centralized decision making, is very centralized, immense sort of political control, even over such things as liberalizing the economy. There's a great reluctance just to let people be agents in society, let society respond as intelligent, lively people see fit, which is pretty much the case in most of the free world. So what you see here is, it's almost quaint that that up to now people have still been wearing masks, and you think back to when we plunged into the pandemic, or in the IRR, I think said, masks are a good thing. We've got to take whatever health measures are needed, look at vaccines, look at all this kind of sensible stuff. But as the evidence and data shifted, so we shifted, society shifted, behaviours shifted. We of course were a bit slower than some other countries too. I mean, I think that's also a token of our overweening emphasis on having kind of central planning and ministers and the command council telling us what to do. Very similar, but even here it was quicker than the mighty economy of China, which was sitting around waiting to be told when it could ditch the mask. And it does, as Sara was saying, it's this question of letting people actually make their own decisions, be agents in their lives, and in that way, that's what a free society is. It's light on its feet, can make quick decisions, respond much more intelligently and speedily to crises, and get over them quicker too, I think.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that point. I think, despite all the kind of noise and the fury and the anger that you saw in the policy discussions around COVID in the, what we might call the free world, in the freer countries of the world, it does actually seem to me that there was probably quite a lot of good to be found there. Oh, sorry, it's not my inverter; it's someone else's inverter beeping background there. There was a real discussion. There was movement, as you say. There was actually more flexibility, perhaps not as much as people wanted, but things did change. Whereas in the sort of authoritarian countries, it very quickly became an excuse for hunting down political opponents, causing trouble, shutting off the economy, causing immense damage to the lives of millions, or in China's case, billions of people. Sara, your thoughts?
No, just to say, it probably looks to China as if the democratic world is chaotic, but the fact that being in a democracy, individuals have their own agency, means everyone will settle into doing what they do best. That works for the economy. And no one is really going to stop us, other than the fact that we may have no electricity and people have gone out of business and blah, 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 et cetera, et cetera. But essentially, it's the fact that at some point we take control of ourselves, and to the extent that we can under the current government. But it's that is actually efficient and results in efficiencies and getting your. I mean, I saw an article the other day about the extraordinary extent to which the American economy is growing, despite all other forecasts. And you think, well, that's not growing because Joe Biden's government is making it grow. So there's a lesson in the difference between command economies and supply.
Right. And despite China's relative liberalization of its economy, it still in many ways is quite a command economy, especially under Xi Jinping, who has dragged it back in that direction over the last few years. Something I think very interesting to ponder. Michael, in 20 seconds or so, any final thoughts on this?
Yes, I completely agree. And the interesting thing I often think is that where people have free reign and agency to act on their own self-interest, one of the first things they consider is the self-interest of others, because they realize it is a relationship. It's not a singular pursuit. It's not solipsistic in any way. It is they see themselves as part of a free society, and intrinsic to that is accommodating and acknowledging and negotiating with the interests of other people. So,
no, I think that's a really good point. All right, that is all the time we have for today. We hope that you found the show interesting, and we will be back tomorrow on the Daily Friend Show. Cheers, everyone, and have a wonderful day.